Everyone at the hospital thought she was just a lonely old woman in a tattered coat, mumbling to herself, shuffling down the sterile hallways, and wasting everyone's time with vague complaints and trembling hands. They rolled their eyes behind her back, whispered that she was probably exaggerating, a drain on the system. But everything changed the moment a new doctor walked in, caught a glimpse of the faded Purple Heart tattoo on her forearm, and fell completely silent. That small symbol revealed a truth that not only stunned the entire room but redefined how they saw her and how she saw herself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the hospital's automatic doors groaned open with their usual tired wheeze. No one paid attention to the older woman who stepped in, her steps unsteady, her coat too heavy for the July heat, her eyes flickering with memories no one cared to ask about. Her name was Martha Lane, but around the VA hospital in Spring Hill, Missouri, they simply called her Miss Lane, in the same tone they used for patients who came in too often and had nothing visibly wrong with them. Her visits were predictable, always around the same time of month, always alone, always lingering in the waiting area longer than necessary. The younger staff didn't bother hiding their frustration anymore. She'd ask vague questions about recurring headaches, joint pain, or chest tightness, and when the tests returned inconclusive, she'd nod, as if expecting the result, and quietly disappear until next time. They didn't know that she slept in a one-bedroom rental above an old mechanic shop, or that she spent most of her days tracing the same stretch of sidewalk between the hospital and her favorite diner where no one knew her name. They didn't know because they didn't ask. On this particular morning, a new intake nurse, fresh out of school, saw Martha hunched in the waiting area and rolled her eyes before glancing at the older nurse beside her. "She's back again?" she whispered, not realizing that Martha's hearing, though dulled, was still good enough to catch the tone, if not the words. The older nurse gave a slight shrug. "She always comes in near the middle of the month. Never anything urgent. Just lonely, maybe." And with that, the file was passed along, half-hearted vitals were taken, and Martha was ushered into a curtained-off exam area where she waited in silence. The young doctor on call that morning, Drive Reynolds, had no history with her and approached the curtain already exhausted from back-to-back cases. Without much eye contact, he skimmed her chart, saw the usual non-specific symptoms, and began a quick examination while asking impersonal questions. Martha answered softly, barely lifting her eyes, gripping the sleeves of her coat like a lifeline. While he listened to her heart and lungs, Dr. Reynolds casually asked how long she'd been feeling this way. Her answer was vague again. For a while now, and he noted it with a sigh. He moved to check her arms for circulation, motioning for her to roll up her sleeves. She hesitated. He repeated himself, and with the same quiet compliance that marked her entire presence, she pushed up her coat sleeve and then the faded sweater beneath. That's when he saw it. Ink, weathered and cracked with age, but unmistakable. A Purple Heart tattoo, detailed and specific, just above the inside of her forearm. He froze. It took only a second for the years of medical training and military exposure to connect the dots. This wasn't a generic patriotic design. This was military issue, the exact replica of the medal awarded for being wounded in combat. Dr. Reynolds blinked, trying to mask his surprise, but something in his posture shifted. His voice, which had been dry and distant, now had a tremor of respect. He asked if she had served. She looked at him for the first time, really looked at him, and gave a small nod. That was all it took. The air in the room changed. Mask. While Martha sat still, unsure of what she'd revealed, Dr. Reynolds stepped out briefly. He didn't go far, just to the nurse's station to quietly request access to Martha Lane's full service record. Within minutes, the results began to populate his screen. His eyebrows raised. Sergeant Martha Lane, deployed 3 times. Served in the 116th Combat Support Hospital during the Gulf War. Received the Purple Heart after sustaining shrapnel injuries during a base attack in 1991. A medic. Decorated. Quiet. Overlooked. He returned to the room with a different energy. He didn't rush. He asked questions, not about her symptoms, but about her, when she last slept, what her support system looked like, whether she had food security. Martha hesitated again, wary of this sudden shift, but eventually the words came out, slow and stilted, like rusty gears grinding to life. She talked about the nightmares, the back pain from years of carrying gear, the headaches that started after the blast, the sense that she was being slowly erased. Dr. Reynolds listened. Outside the curtain, whispers were beginning to form. The nurses noticed how long the doctor was spending with her. A couple peered over their screens to catch a glimpse. That's when word began to spread, not just about her military service, but about what everyone had missed. The whispers that had once mocked her were now laced with curiosity and guilt. Some of the staff began pulling up her file, reading the history they'd never bothered to look at before. Martha Lane wasn't just a repeat patient. She was a combat medic, a decorated veteran, a survivor. And yet, until today, no one had seen her. Martha Lane's life had always been a collection of contradictions, soft-spoken yet steely, small in stature but commanding in her quiet way. At 71, her frame had shrunk slightly with age, her back bent just enough to betray the years of wear on her joints and soul, but her eyes, hazel with flecks of green, still held the same alertness that had once scanned battlefields for wounded soldiers. She walked with caution, not because she was weak, but because she knew better than anyone how fragile the human body could be. She carried a frayed leather bag at her side, patched and stitched over the years, filled not with medication or personal effects, but with handwritten journals, worn-down pencils, and folded clippings from old newspapers. It was her way of staying anchored, a silent resistance to disappearing completely. No one had ever asked about the bag, or the careful way she always held it to her chest as if it contained her heartbeat. But it did. Memories, names, scraps of lives she couldn't forget even if everyone else had. She lived alone in a second-story apartment above Harold's Auto Service on the edge of town. The place wasn't much, and the stairs had grown less friendly over the years, but the landlord let her stay on a month-to-month basis in exchange for keeping an eye on the place after hours. She cooked on a single-burner stove, heated the space with a rattling radiator that barely worked, and listened to old jazz records on a battered player she found at a pawn shop 10 years ago. Her walls were bare, except for one frame, a black-and-white photo of a group of medics posing under a canvas tent, all dust and sweat and tired smiles. She was there, second from the right, her hair pinned back, a cigarette tucked behind her ear, her hand resting on the shoulder of a younger soldier who hadn't made it home. She never spoke about him. She never spoke much at all. Basuchesh. Each day was a quiet loop. Wake at 6, stretch against the peeling wall to keep her back from stiffening, walk to Betty's Diner 2 blocks down, sit in the same booth by the window, and order black coffee with 2 slices of rye toast. The waitress, Carla, knew her order by heart, but not her story. She'd refill Martha's cup with a polite smile, ask how she was doing, and move on before the answer arrived. Martha didn't mind. She wasn't chasing attention, just warmth. After breakfast, she'd walk the long way to the VA hospital, even if she didn't have an appointment. Some days she sat in the chapel. Other days she wandered the hallways or pretended to read the health pamphlets in the lobby. It wasn't that she enjoyed hospitals. God knew she'd spent enough time in them, but it was one of the few places where uniforms still passed by her, where the smell of antiseptic reminded her she'd once mattered. Idmua. Her life after the military had never quite found its rhythm. The transition from combat zones to civilian life was jarring in ways she couldn't prepare for. She had tried to work, brief stints in nursing homes, first aid volunteering at the community center, but none of it fit. Too slow, too impersonal, too sanitized. The adrenaline she had lived on for so long had nowhere to go, and over time, it calcified into insomnia and restlessness. Her body bore the evidence of war. A scar on her abdomen where shrapnel had lodged itself, a pinched nerve in her right shoulder, and an ache in her knees that forecasted every storm. But those were the visible wounds. The invisible ones, the ones she couldn't name aloud, lingered like fog. The panic when a car backfired. The cold sweat when she smelled diesel. The guilt that came in waves. Survivor's guilt, they called it. A tidy label for a sprawling ache. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had no family left. Her brother had died in a car accident 2 years after she returned stateside, and her parents had long passed by then. She never married. Once, she had come close. A young Marine she met at a training base in Georgia, a whirlwind romance that fizzled under the weight of distance and trauma neither could articulate. She'd received one letter from him after their final phone call, neatly folded and unsigned. She kept it in her journal, read it on her birthday, and then tucked it away again. Love had knocked. She just never opened the door. Facts away. Over time, the world seemed to forget her. She had long ago accepted that the world forgets quiet people, especially when they're women, and especially when their battles don't leave loud, visible marks. No one thanked her for her service anymore. Fewer people even asked if she'd served. Her coat, always slightly too large, hid the strength in her shoulders. Her silence camouflaged the fire that still simmered beneath her skin. People saw a fragile woman. What they didn't see was the soldier beneath the layers, the healer who had stopped bleeding with bare hands, who had carried wounded men across burning ground, who had memorized the faces of every man who died in her arms. Still, Martha didn't walk around angry. She had made peace, in her own way, with the invisibility. She had trained herself to be small, to take up little space, to nod politely when dismissed. But sometimes, in moments of stillness, she'd catch her reflection in a shop window or a hospital mirror and whisper to herself that she was still here, still standing, still ready. Her tattoo, a small weathered purple heart, inked during her last tour by a fellow medic with shaking hands, was the only thing she ever let mark her body. She had never gotten it touched up, never wanted it freshened. It aged with her. It was her truth. Iron hand. And so, when she stepped into the VA hospital that July morning, she wasn't seeking glory or recognition. She wasn't hoping someone would notice. She just wanted someone to care enough to ask the right question. To see her, really see her, just once. She didn't know yet that today would be that day. That a glance at her arm would change everything. That, for the first time in decades, her story was about to be pulled from the shadows and given the light it had always deserved. Spring Hill wasn't a city that called attention to itself. It was the kind of town that felt paused in time. Rows of low, sun-bleached buildings, a courthouse with chipped columns in the square, and a faded mural on Main Street painted in colors that once felt patriotic, but now looked more like nostalgia on its last legs. Veterans lived quietly here, tucked into the corners of apartments above hardware stores or in the trailers along the wooded edge of town. No one really asked about anyone's past. You were either known because you stayed, or forgotten because you left. Most days in Spring Hill passed without incident, just the slow churn of small-town routine. But for the veterans who drifted through the VA hospital on the east side of town, that routine came with the bitter taste of being both necessary and overlooked. The VA hospital itself was built in the 1970s and looked like it. Beige bricks stacked like tired promises, narrow windows that let in too little sunlight, and an automatic sliding door that coughed every time it opened, as though even the building was weary. Inside, the air was cold and dry, a manufactured sterility that did its best to erase the messiness of human pain. Bulletin boards lined the walls, cluttered with yellowing flyers about support groups and prescription plans, while laminated posters reminded visitors that help was available, if only they knew who to ask and had the energy to persist. The front desk was a long counter, always slightly understaffed, manned by receptionists who rotated shifts with the same polite detachment. Across from it sat the waiting area, hard-backed chairs arranged in neat rows, coffee-stained magazines from 5 years ago, and a mounted television playing daytime talk shows at a volume just low enough to be irritating. This was the place where Martha returned, month after month, not for treatment exactly, but for presence. The VA was one of the few places where no one asked why she wasn't working, or why she didn't have anyone picking her up. It was a place that, at least on paper, understood her. But even here, surrounded by symbols of service and sacrifice, she was invisible. The environment fostered a strange contradiction: respect and bureaucracy living side by side. Staff wore pins that said, "Thank you for your service," but their eyes often glazed over when a veteran needed more than a signature or a refill. The system was overwhelmed, the staff stretched thin, and empathy was a luxury that came in short supply. The hospital's physical layout mirrored its emotional atmosphere: winding hallways that led to nowhere in particular, clinical white walls that drained the color from every face that passed through. The nurses' station on the main floor buzzed with low chatter and blinking monitors, but the conversations often blurred into white noise. Rooms were divided by curtains instead of doors, a design meant for efficiency that sacrificed privacy. The elevator creaked, the vending machines were half-stocked, and the intercom system occasionally let out a garbled call that no one fully understood. And yet, amidst this sterile setting, lives flickered on the edge of awareness: patients pacing the floor with distant eyes, war veterans mumbling names no one else knew, and people like Martha quietly waiting for someone to look beyond the surface. Outside, the grounds were modest but tended. A flagpole stood in the courtyard, its American flag fraying slightly at the edges, always at full mast unless ordered otherwise. There was a memorial plaque near the entrance, surrounded by a small garden of lavender and marigold that had clearly been someone's pet project. A bench sat beneath a gnarled oak tree, offering a quiet space to anyone who needed a moment of peace between appointments or memories. Martha often paused there before going inside. She'd sit for a few minutes, watching the breeze ruffle the petals, letting the quiet settle over her before the fluorescent reality of the hospital swallowed her whole again. The social dynamics within the hospital were shaped by a combination of hierarchy, burnout, and good intentions, dulled by repetition. Doctors rotated between shifts, many of them juggling private practices or other hospitals. Nurses bore the brunt of the emotional labor, handling complaints, soothing nerves, and managing stacks of paperwork that grew no matter how many hours they worked. Interns tried to keep up, some eager, some already jaded, and then there were the patients, each carrying stories the staff rarely had time to hear. There were the younger veterans, still limping from recent wars, whose faces tightened with embarrassment when asked about PTSD. There were older ones, like Martha, who had learned to expect nothing. And there were the ghosts, the ones who no longer showed up, their absence noticed only in the way their appointment slots remained blank. It was a world built on protocol and procedure, where compassion sometimes drowned under compliance. But within that framework, there were still flickers of humanity. A nurse who brought her own coffee from home to share with a patient who couldn't afford it, a janitor who learned the names of regulars and greeted them like old friends, and once in a while, a doctor who still remembered why they chose this field in the first place. It was into this environment that Martha entered, her presence barely registering to most. But the hospital had seen her enough times to recognize her face, even if they didn't know her story. She was part of the scenery now, a fixture that blended into the beige walls and quiet shuffles. Yet the truth was, this place had once been something else entirely to her. Years ago, when her body was stronger and her voice less hesitant, she'd volunteered here, unofficially at first, helping older vets navigate their paperwork, guiding them toward the right departments, offering directions and small comforts. Back then, she still wore her service pin on her jacket. Back then, people had asked her about her time overseas. But as time passed and faces changed, she slipped further into anonymity. Eventually, even the volunteers stopped calling her by name. The hospital that had once been a symbol of shared purpose had become a place of quiet erasure. Yet Martha returned, again and again, not out of habit, but out of something deeper. Some part of her still hoped that someone would see the truth beneath her silence, that someone would remember what she had given. She didn't need medals. She just needed to be seen. And soon, against the backdrop of this indifferent environment, that long-awaited moment would finally arrive. For every hospital that functioned on compassion and duty, there were always cracks in its foundation, places where bias, impatience, and human ego leaked through. At the Spring Hill VA Hospital, one such crack had a name: Janine Cordell. She was the supervising administrator for outpatient services, a title that sounded helpful but rarely played out that way in practice. Janine had worked at the VA for nearly 16 years and had long since stopped seeing people, only problems, numbers, and cases, to be processed or discarded depending on their level of inconvenience. She wasn't malicious in the cartoonish sense, no overt cruelty or dramatic meltdowns. She simply believed she was always right, and that most veterans who walked through the hospital doors were either exaggerating their conditions or looking for handouts. Her smile was as tight as the bun she wore every day, and her voice carried the clinical sharpness of someone who thought empathy was inefficient. Veterans who spoke too slowly, had trouble filling forms, or came without referrals, were met with her passive-aggressive tone and dismissive glances. To her, bureaucracy wasn't a barrier, it was a filter, and she used it expertly. Janine had taken particular notice of Martha Lane. Not because she knew her story, but because Martha represented everything Janine resented about repeat visitors. The older woman never had a formal appointment, just walk-ins or vague symptoms that required screenings. She never demanded anything outright but lingered, hovering in corners, sitting too long in waiting areas, asking quiet questions that slowed down the rhythm of the front desk. Janine didn't have the patience for ambiguity. To her, Martha was a drain, an echo of the countless unclaimed cases that cluttered the VA's resources. She'd made a habit of telling new staff not to encourage people like Martha. She doesn't need a doctor. She needs a companion or a therapist, Janine once told a nurse who had tried to give Martha extra time. She's lonely, not sick. It wasn't just words. Janine's influence shaped the culture around her. Nurses who tried to advocate too hard found themselves left out of meetings. Newer staff, hoping to fit in, followed her lead, learning to roll their eyes when Martha walked in or to answer her inquiries with canned responses. Even the security guard at the front entrance had picked up on the unspoken tone. Let her in, but don't engage. Over time, Martha learned to expect it. She didn't take it personally, though the weight of that dismissal grew heavier with each visit. She still offered a nod when greeted coldly, still thanked them for their time, and still waited patiently, even when the same people who ignored her helped others with more enthusiasm. But Janine's behavior wasn't just personal preference, it was a symptom of something bigger, something systemic. In truth, Janine represented the kind of institutional gatekeeping that made so many veterans fall through the cracks. Her obsession with control, her need for order, and her intolerance for complexity made her hostile to any case that didn't fit a checklist. And Martha, with her vague symptoms and quiet presence, never stood a chance in that environment. Janine didn't see the faded coat and cautious posture as signs of trauma. She saw them as weakness. And while she never raised her voice, her judgments were felt in every withheld glance, every curt instruction, every report that got filed without urgency. She considered herself a realist. Others just thought of her as cold. The doctors, many of whom rotated between departments or were too busy to notice the subtleties of Janine's power, often deferred to her decisions about scheduling and prioritization. She controlled access, who got in to see specialists, who got follow-ups, and who sat in limbo until they gave up. It was this quiet control that made her dangerous. And yet, in the strange hierarchy of institutional settings, no one really challenged her. The senior staff had grown used to her. The junior staff feared her. And the patients, well, most didn't even know her name. They just knew that sometimes they were treated with care, and other times they were treated like Martha. That July morning, as Martha checked in and took her seat in the waiting area, Janine had already noticed her from across the reception desk. She didn't say anything, just narrowed her eyes slightly, then whispered something to one of the front desk clerks. The clerk nodded, took Martha's name, and placed her file in the lower priority tray without comment. It was subtle, practiced. A small delay here, a missing form there, enough to slow down the process without it ever looking intentional. Martha waited, as she always did, without complaint. She clutched her worn leather bag and stared ahead, occasionally glancing at the clock that hadn't worked in weeks. In the nearby office, Janine sat down at her desk, opened her email, and sipped her lukewarm coffee. She glanced through the list of patients being seen that day, noting the names she recognized. When she saw Martha's on the list, she rolled her eyes to herself. Another non-diagnosis. Another drain on resources. She didn't bother looking deeper. Didn't notice the Purple Heart notation buried in the electronic file. Didn't bother reading the incident report from 1991 that detailed the injuries Martha sustained while shielding 2 soldiers from a mortar blast. Didn't even see the commendation letter scanned into the system years ago and long since buried by interface updates and database reorganizations. To Janine, Martha Lane was just another ghost in the machine, letera. And so the cycle repeated. A veteran entered, invisible. A gatekeeper maintained the gates. The system creaked forward, indifferent. But what Janine didn't realize, what she could never anticipate, was that this particular day, this ordinary-seeming morning, would unravel that system in a way she couldn't control. Because for the first time, someone new was going to see what she had always chosen not to. A doctor, with fresh eyes. A mind unshaped by local gossip and office politics. And once that doctor saw the truth etched into Martha's skin, no amount of bureaucracy would be able to erase it. The moment was coming, quiet and sure as a rising tide. And when it did, the balance of power inside the hospital's beige walls would begin to shift. Martha Lane's life had long since settled into a rhythm that was both predictable and lonely, a quiet ritual crafted not from habit, but from necessity. Every third Thursday of the month, she would make her way to the VA hospital in Spring Hill just after 9 a.m., always dressed in the same worn coat, regardless of the weather, always with her bag tucked firmly under her arm, and always with a slight limp that came and went, depending on the humidity. It wasn't that she believed the visits would fix anything. Not anymore. It was simply the last thread of connection she had to a system that once meant something to her. A system she had served with blood and grit. Her ritual was part medical, part psychological, and part hopeful, though even she couldn't quite define what she was hoping for anymore. It was as if by showing up, by remaining visible in a place meant for people like her, she was refusing to fully disappear. Each visit followed the same sequence. First, she would sit at Betty's diner, sip her coffee in silence while watching the same server refill the same sugar jars at the same time. Then she would take the long route to the hospital, passing the American Legion post, where old veterans sat outside smoking cigarettes with their hats pulled low. She would nod politely, sometimes receiving a nod in return, though rarely more than that. The camaraderie that once existed among veterans had thinned over the years, replaced by distance and distraction. By the time she reached the hospital's front entrance, her steps had already slowed, not just from age, but from the psychological weight she carried. The walk into that building was not just physical. It was a crossing into a world where she was both seen and unseen, needed and ignored. At the check-in desk, the faces had changed over time, but the treatment remained the same. Her file was familiar to the staff, an elderly female veteran with a vague history of pain, anxiety, insomnia, and non-specific ailments. The notes in the system grew longer with each visit, not with new findings but with notations about her behavior, pleasant but vague. No acute distress. Symptoms appear chronic, no change from prior visits. These were the clinical ways they said, "We don't know what's wrong, and we don't have time to find out." It wasn't negligence in the traditional sense. It was something more insidious, an apathy born of routine, the kind that reduces people to files and their pain to white noise. After check-in, she would wait, always in the same chair, second from the left in the row closest to the elevator. It squeaked slightly when she sat down, and she found a small comfort in that familiar sound. Time passed differently in hospital waiting rooms, stretched thin, suspended between interruptions. She would read from her journal or trace the pattern of the floor tiles with her eyes. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and try to remember the sound of helicopter blades or the way the sand clung to her boots during deployment. These memories were sharp, vivid, alive, so different from the muted interactions that filled her days now. Eventually, a nurse would call her name. Some said it kindly, others didn't bother hiding the impatience in their voice. She would rise slowly, with deliberate care, and follow them back to the exam area. It was always the same. Blood pressure, pulse, temperature, and a few questions delivered more out of duty than concern. She'd answer them quietly, offering just enough detail to seem cooperative, never enough to spark real curiosity. Then she'd be led to a curtained room where she would wait again, often for longer than anyone intended. Doctors would come and go. Some were quick, glancing at her chart before offering generic advice. Others tried a bit harder, asking questions that hinted at genuine interest, but eventually backed off when they couldn't find anything concrete. She never blamed them. They were part of the same machine, and she had been in enough field units to know how resources and time dictated behavior. The pattern never broke. If she brought up the nightmares, they offered sleep aids. If she mentioned her chest tightness, they scheduled a stress test 6 weeks out. If she talked about her shoulder pain, they prescribed exercises and ice. No one ever asked about the tattoo. No one ever looked at her service history unless prompted, and she never prompted them. There was an unspoken agreement, it seemed, that she would not demand too much, and they would not dig too deep. Her identity as a veteran was on record, but it never felt acknowledged. It was a label, not a story. There were moments, brief ones, when she thought of stopping the ritual entirely. What was the point, after all? The routine visits didn't change anything. The system wasn't going to suddenly start seeing her as more than an aging woman with unclear symptoms. But something always pulled her back. Maybe it was the stubborn thread of hope that one day someone would ask the right question, would see the faded ink on her arm and realize it wasn't decorative. It was earned. Maybe it was the belief that by simply showing up, she was asserting her right to exist within this space, to not be forgotten. Or maybe it was just that the hospital, for all its flaws, was still a place where she could pretend for a little while that she mattered. And so the ritual continued, month after month, year after year. A cycle of quiet endurance, a demonstration of strength that no one recognized. Until that morning, when a new doctor stepped into the exam room, noticed the way her sleeve bunched at her elbow, and asked her to roll it up. Until the precise moment when the ritual cracked open and something different flickered beneath the surface. That single glance, one pair of fresh eyes, was about to unravel years of being overlooked. Martha didn't know it yet, but her cycle of invisibility had finally come to its breaking point. It was a Thursday like any other at the Spring Hill VA, except for the subtle ripple created by a new name on the rotation schedule. Dr. Lucas Arden. He was fresh to the Spring Hill branch, but not to service or medicine. Having completed his residency at a large metropolitan VA facility in Denver, Lucas had requested a reassignment to a smaller town, hoping for a quieter environment after 3 years of burnout and bureaucracy. His supervisors were surprised. Spring Hill was not exactly a destination, but Lucas didn't want glamour. He wanted to reconnect with the reason he'd entered medicine in the first place. His father, a Vietnam veteran, had died while waiting for basic approval from the VA years earlier, and that bitter memory had etched itself into Lucas's sense of responsibility. He had vowed never to forget the value of those who served, and he carried that vow into every examination room like a quiet oath. Lucas had only been on site for 4 days when he first noticed Martha Lane's name. It came to him the way most names did, on a clipboard passed by a nurse who didn't expect much from the appointment. "She's one of our regulars," the nurse murmured, eyes already scanning the next chart. "Mostly vague symptoms. Nothing critical. We don't usually do much more than a checkup and move her along." Lucas nodded without replying, but he didn't dismiss the note. Instead, he asked for her full file and, out of habit, scrolled through the digital records that many had glossed over. His fingers paused as he reached a scanned document embedded deep in the archives. A service record, partially faded, detailing deployment to a combat medical unit in 1991. Further down, a citation for valor, and at the very bottom, a note added by a physician over 15 years ago. Purple Heart recipient. Tattoo confirmed on left forearm. That sentence gripped him. It was rare enough to see women with combat medals from that era, but rarer still to see the system take notice. He felt the stirrings of that old ache in his chest, what his father used to call the sound of the country forgetting its soldiers. Lucas entered the exam room and found her sitting exactly as the nurse had described, shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes lowered. She didn't rise, nor did she seem particularly interested in who had just come through the curtain. She had seen enough white coats to know most of them by routine, not by name. But Lucas didn't start with his clipboard. Instead, he offered a greeting and then sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. He asked her how she was, not just physically but generally, softly enough that it didn't sound like a formality. Martha responded the same way she always did, with polite brevity. She mentioned some dizziness, an ache in her back, occasional shortness of breath, symptoms that could mean anything or nothing, symptoms she'd lived with for years. Lucas listened, not the way most people listen to move the conversation forward, but the kind of listening that creates space. And then, as he began his examination, he gently asked her to roll up her sleeve so he could take her blood pressure. Martha hesitated. Not for long, just a second. But Lucas saw it, the small pause, the flicker of something held back. And then she moved, her hands deft despite the stiffness, pulling back her coat and sweater in practiced motions. The faded ink on her left forearm emerged like a whisper from the past. Lucas froze, not in confusion, but in recognition. The tattoo was exactly as described, a well-done rendering of the Purple Heart medal, dulled by time but unmistakable. It wasn't flashy. There was no patriotic flourish, no bold script. It was quiet and plain, like its bearer, and yet it carried the weight of something undeniable. A.T. Lucas didn't gasp. He didn't launch into praise. He simply looked at her, truly looked, and asked, in the same steady tone, if she had served as a medic. Martha's head tilted slightly, and for the first time in the appointment, her eyes met his. They weren't suspicious or proud, just tired and curious. She gave a small nod. That was all. But for Lucas, it was enough. Buxus. He didn't leave the room immediately. Instead, he asked if she would mind if he reviewed her file more thoroughly, if they could maybe talk a little longer than her usual appointments. She nodded again, slower this time, as if unsure whether this sudden attention would lead to anything different. He stepped out briefly, returned with a tablet, and began scanning her file with new purpose. As he read through the decades-old reports, overlooked mental health screenings, and generalized physical complaints, a story began to emerge, not of a hypochondriac or a lonely senior, but of a veteran who had fallen through the cracks year after year because she never raised her voice and never demanded what she was owed. The hospital outside that curtain continued in its usual rhythm. Phones rang, carts squeaked across linoleum floors, and nurses paged doctors with bored efficiency. But in that tiny corner of the VA, something was shifting. A witness had arrived, not just someone who saw a patient, but someone who recognized the layers beneath her silence. Lucas wasn't moved by pity. He was moved by truth. Martha Lane was a decorated veteran, a combat medic whose records had been buried under decades of administrative dust. And yet she came back month after month, quietly asking to be seen, not for the glory of her past, but because her present was hurting, and she no longer had the words to explain it. Lucas didn't yet know the full scope of what she had endured, but he knew enough to realize that this wasn't just another case. This was a reckoning. He sat a little straighter, made detailed notes, and scheduled an immediate follow-up, one that wouldn't take 6 weeks. He requested a consult with a trauma specialist. He flagged her file for priority review, and in doing so, he unknowingly disrupted a long-standing pattern of indifference. Because sometimes, all it takes to dismantle a wall is for someone to notice the crack and lean into it. Lucas Arden had become that crack in the system, one that would widen into a rupture neither he nor Martha yet fully understood. But the shift had begun. The witness had arrived. When Martha Lane stepped out of the exam room that day, she felt something she hadn't in a long while, a strange, cautious warmth flickering in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't relief exactly, nor hope. It was more like the stirrings of acknowledgement, the fragile sense that someone had finally paused long enough to really look at her instead of through her. She didn't smile, not outwardly. Old habits made her face a mask of stillness, but beneath that surface, something had shifted. She took her usual seat near the elevator and waited for her name to be called again, this time for blood work. Normally, she wouldn't have agreed to it. What was the point, when the conclusions were always vague? But today, Dr. Arden had asked, not out of obligation, but with the kind of sincerity that made refusal feel like erasing a chance. Lucas Arden, on the other hand, didn't return to his office right away. He stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the significance of what he'd seen settle in his mind like dust catching light. Martha's tattoo had struck him in a way he couldn't fully explain. He had seen plenty of ink on patients, eagles, dates, names of fallen friends, but that one was different. Not just because it was a Purple Heart, but because of where it was placed and how it had faded. It told a story without telling one at all. The slight scarring near the edges of the design, barely noticeable, spoke volumes. It wasn't ornamental. It wasn't a tribute done years later in comfort. It was likely given in the field, under less than sanitary conditions, by someone whose hands were shaking with adrenaline. It was not a decoration. It was a memory burned into skin. He returned to the nurse's station and asked for her full paper file, not just the digital summary. One of the older nurses looked up from her computer and raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "That one's thick," she muttered, nodding toward the storage drawer that hadn't been opened in weeks. Lucas simply nodded. As the nurse went to retrieve the file, she made an offhand comment that didn't sit right. "She's one of those lifers. Comes in a lot, doesn't ever say much. Most of us figure she just likes the attention." Lucas didn't respond, but his silence was heavy. He took the file with care and sat down to go through it page by page. The deeper he went, the more furious he became, not in a loud, visible way, but in the slow-burning, moral kind of way that came when patterns of neglect revealed themselves over time. Her records showed consistent symptoms that had been reported for years: fatigue, joint pain, insomnia, hypervigilance, occasional dissociative episodes. Individually, they looked like age. Together, they screamed combat-related trauma, undiagnosed and untreated. He found a note from a psychologist dated 12 years ago that suggested PTSD, but the referral had never been followed through. A series of missed appointments were logged over the years, but each one was marked with transportation difficulty or communication error. No one had followed up. There were requests for imaging that were never approved due to budget constraints, medications prescribed and discontinued without full explanations. An entire career of service, and a lifetime of being left to manage it alone. But what confirmed everything for Lucas was a one-page document nearly stuck to the back cover. It was a photocopy of an old commendation letter, stained by time, barely legible, with frayed edges. It described an incident in 1991 where Martha, under mortar fire, had crawled across exposed terrain to treat and evacuate 2 wounded infantrymen. Despite sustaining injuries herself, she refused evacuation until both soldiers were stabilized and transported to safety. One of them had written a statement from his hospital bed, detailing how she had kept him alive with only gauze, pressure, and grit. The letter had ended with a recommendation for a Purple Heart and possible Bronze Star, though only the Purple Heart had been processed due to record-keeping issues during redeployment. Lucas stared at the paper until the text blurred. There it was, proof, not just of her service, but of the kind of bravery that earned headlines when performed by others. Typically men, typically louder, typically backed by more efficient documentation. She had never mentioned it, never leveraged it. She had just endured. Kaino. Later that afternoon, Lucas returned to the waiting room, holding her updated chart in hand, and called Martha back for a follow-up discussion. She followed him with her usual quiet grace, clutching her bag, eyes low. When they entered the room, Lucas didn't start with more questions. Instead, he laid the commendation letter on the table between them and gently slid it toward her. Martha stared at it for a long moment, then looked up, her expression unreadable. Lucas didn't speak. He simply met her gaze and nodded once, the kind of nod that carried weight. Recognition, validation, and something else. Respect. Martha didn't touch the letter. Her hand trembled slightly, and then, almost imperceptibly, she exhaled, a long, tired breath she hadn't even known she'd been holding. And in that moment, she knew. He had seen her, not as a frail old woman, not as a frequent flyer in the system, but as the medic who had once run through fire because 2 men needed her. Her silence hadn't hidden her story. It had preserved it, waiting for the right set of eyes to uncover it again. Lucas promised her, quietly and firmly, that things would change. He was going to escalate her case, fast-track her for evaluations, and ensure her service record was fully restored in the system. He also told her something she never expected to hear again. "You've done more than enough. Let us take care of you now." For a woman who had spent most of her life proving her worth without being asked, those words landed like a soft explosion. And as she left the room that day, she didn't limp quite as noticeably. The weight hadn't lifted entirely, but it had shifted. The recognition she had never demanded was finally taking root. A truth too long buried had begun to rise. The shift that began in that quiet exam room did not go unnoticed for long. Systems, especially rigid bureaucratic ones like the Spring Hill VA, had a way of detecting disruption, even when it came in the form of overdue justice. Within 24 hours, a ripple had made its way through the hospital's internal channels, a request for priority testing, a flagged record for expedited psychological evaluation, a recommendation for service-connected disability reassessment. These were not minor tasks. They required approvals, triggered budget reviews, involved interdepartmental communication, and, inevitably, they passed across the desk of Janine Cordell. She sat stiffly in her office, scrolling through the request logs while stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. When she came across Martha Lane's name highlighted in red, her expression barely changed, but her pulse quickened. She clicked the case open and scanned the notes. The physician's name, Dr. Lucas Arden. She had only met him once during orientation, had made a mental note that he was one of those idealistic types who always tried too hard in the beginning. Now here he was, prioritizing one of her least favorite patients, tying up staff time and system bandwidth over someone who, in her eyes, had never demonstrated any critical need. Janine reread the notes: Purple Heart recognition, unprocessed commendation, indications of untreated combat trauma. A service file that had gone cold and quiet for decades now stirring with activity. She narrowed her eyes. She didn't like this, not because she doubted the content, but because it challenged her control. Martha Lane had been an unremarkable fixture in this place for years. Predictable, forgettable, easy to push to the margins. And now, suddenly, she was a priority? Janine wasn't one to take public action hastily, but she knew how to apply pressure through internal channels. She started with an email to Human Resources, masked in concern but loaded with implication. Dr. Arden appears to be overriding protocol. Has anyone verified the necessity of this reevaluation? She followed with a flagged message to the scheduling department, subtly questioning the use of resources for a non-acute case. Lucas, for his part, had no idea he had triggered a power play. He was too focused on results. Over the next 48 hours, he pulled Martha's scans forward, personally walked her file to the psych department, and coordinated with the claims officer to reopen her disability case. When one of the nurses warned him, in a hushed voice, that Janine had been asking questions, he shrugged. He had no time for office politics. The woman needed care. The woman had earned it. That was the beginning and end of his motivation. But bureaucracy doesn't bend easily, especially when pride is involved. A day later, Lucas was summoned to an administrative meeting. A routine review, they called it, but the undercurrent was clear. Janine was there, flanked by 2 senior administrators and 1 compliance officer. She kept her tone even, but every word she spoke dripped with condescension. She questioned the efficiency of his methods, the, quote, urgency of the reassessment, and whether it was appropriate for him to bypass the typical referral system. Lucas, composed but resolute, laid out the facts. He showed them the commendation letter. He detailed Martha's symptoms and how they aligned with untreated trauma. He explained how her record had been buried, neglected, and ignored for years, not through malice, but through systemic inertia. Janine interjected with a patronizing smile, noting that we all want what's best for our veterans, but that proper procedure must be followed to ensure fairness to all patients. Lucas felt the insult in her words, the suggestion that his compassion was a disruption, that prioritizing a woman who had risked her life was somehow unfair to the system. He wanted to shout, but he didn't. Instead, he asked a question no one was prepared to answer. How many other cases like hers are waiting in silence because we assume quiet means unimportant? There was a pause. A long, heavy one. The compliance officer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. One of the senior administrators cleared his throat and mumbled something about reviewing past cases for oversight. Janine remained composed, but the flicker in her eyes betrayed her. She had expected to shut him down, but instead, she had only hardened his resolve. Meanwhile, Martha began to feel the consequences in her own subtle way. The receptionist, who usually avoided eye contact, now called her name with a tight-lipped smile. A few nurses who had previously acted distant now offered small gestures, holding the door, asking about her day. But there were also signs of resistance. Her imaging appointment was pushed by a day without explanation. A prescription refill took longer than usual. She noticed Janine watching her once from down the hall, not with curiosity, but with a kind of cold calculation. Martha knew that look. She'd seen it on commanding officers who didn't like questions. Still, she said nothing. She had learned long ago how to move quietly through hostile spaces. Lucas, however, was not quiet. He began compiling a report, not just about Martha, but about other patients whose care had been delayed or minimized. He didn't make accusations. He made observations, patterns, trends, cases of neglect not out of evil, but out of policy, paperwork, and pride. He requested a review by the regional director. It was a gamble, and he knew it. But if pushing back meant risking his position, so be it. The system had failed someone who had served in silence for decades. He wasn't going to let it happen again. And so, the tension built. Janine doubled down on enforcing protocol, quietly discrediting him through whispered remarks and veiled criticisms. Lucas pushed forward with determination, documenting everything, building allies among staff who had long felt voiceless. And Martha, caught in the middle, found herself the unlikely center of a quiet war, one between indifference and acknowledgement, between a past long buried and a future that might finally offer dignity. The confrontation had begun, not with shouting, but with documentation, meetings, and systemic defiance. The stakes were rising, and as the lines between right and procedure blurred, the quiet woman with the faded tattoo sat patiently, never knowing just how much her truth was shaking the foundations around her. While administrators shuffled reports and meetings became battlegrounds of veiled arguments, Martha Lane remained consistent in the only way she knew how, by showing up. She didn't voice complaints or ask for special attention. Instead, she arrived for each newly scheduled appointment precisely on time, her posture just a bit straighter than usual, and her coat buttoned to the top even in the summer heat. Beneath that coat, her forearm bore the same Purple Heart tattoo that had gone ignored for decades, but now it felt different. Not because it had changed, but because someone had finally seen it, truly seen it. That small acknowledgement had planted something resilient in her. A quiet sense of validation, like a long-lost piece of herself, had finally been handed back. And while Martha didn't believe in grand gestures or public statements, she believed in presence, in responsibility, and in walking into every room with the quiet authority of someone who had already survived worse. The hospital staff began to notice. Not just the administrators who watched her case with growing unease, but the custodians who passed her in the hall, the transport staff who wheeled patients across the facility, and the younger nurses who had never before paused to wonder why this woman with such a fragile frame carried herself like she'd led missions under fire. They started to ask questions, not to her, but to each other. Who was she, really? What had she done? The rumors trickled through the hospital like a quiet breeze, not malicious, but charged with curiosity. Some remembered the days when Martha first started coming, how she never made a scene and always seemed to be waiting for something just beyond reach. Now that something had a name, recognition. But it wasn't until her scheduled group therapy session that Martha's true character quietly stunned those who thought they understood her. As part of the trauma reassessment Dr. Arden had requested, she'd been enrolled in a small PTSD support group consisting of veterans from various conflicts, men and women alike, most of whom had become accustomed to staying guarded. On the day of her first session, Martha arrived early, sat at the edge of the circle, and kept her gaze low while others filed in. The facilitator, a retired Navy psychotherapist named Evelyn Cass, welcomed the group and began the session with a familiar prompt. What's one thing you wish civilians understood about your experience? The room was quiet for a moment before someone, a wiry young man with marine ink down his forearm, spoke about feeling like a ghost in his own family. Another woman, who had served in Iraq, talked about the way loud noises made her flinch and how her husband never quite understood why. The group moved slowly, each person contributing in fragments. When it was Martha's turn, she hesitated. Evelyn didn't rush her, and finally, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, Martha said, "That silence doesn't mean nothing happened." The room stilled. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it, with a calmness that came from years of being misinterpreted, years of letting others speak over her and still showing up. She didn't elaborate, but she didn't need to. In that moment, everyone in the room seemed to feel the gravity behind her words. Evelyn would later tell Lucas that in all her years of leading trauma groups, she had never seen a presence so quietly commanding. Martha didn't dominate the conversation or interrupt others, but when she spoke again, later in the session, to explain how during her second deployment she learned to stuff cotton into her ears during shelling so she could keep working through the noise, it became clear she wasn't just another vet coping with fear. She was someone who had conditioned herself to function inside of it. It wasn't about survival for her. It had been about others. Always others. Lucas, meanwhile, continued to push for progress behind the scenes. When a staff member from the regional director's office contacted him for further clarification on Martha's case, He sent them everything: the commendation letter, a new write-up on her untreated symptoms, her participation in therapy, and a professional opinion declaring her service-connected injuries both physical and psychological. When the representative called him back, they asked, "Why was this never reviewed properly before?" Lucas didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was written in every overlooked appointment, every dismissed concern, every administrator who decided she didn't look like the kind of veteran who'd earned special treatment. Back at the hospital, Janine Cordell wasn't finished. She had caught wind of the regional interest in Martha's file and felt her control slipping. One afternoon, she made an unannounced appearance in the group therapy session, clipboard in hand, wearing the practiced smile of institutional authority. She claimed it was a, quote, routine audit, checking in on group dynamics and attendance. But her eyes went straight to Martha. The temperature in the room shifted. Evelyn, not one to back down, politely asked if Janine had cleared the visit with mental health services. Janine deflected the question and instead approached Martha after the session, her voice low but firm. "You know," she began, "not every story needs to be reopened. Sometimes what's in the past is best left there." Martha stared at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then she stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the kind of stillness that commands attention. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply said, "You had your chance to see me years ago. You chose not to. That doesn't mean I stopped existing." Janine blinked, taken off guard, and for the first time in years, she didn't know what to say. She turned without another word and walked out of the room, her confidence shaken not by confrontation, but by the unmistakable strength of a woman who had no more use for silence. Martha had never needed to prove her worth, but in every gesture, in every room she walked into, in every quiet breath she took while refusing to disappear, she demonstrated something undeniable. True character isn't built in public, it's built in shadows. And when the light finally finds it, it doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand. It began with a letter, folded in a stiff cream-colored envelope bearing the Department of Veterans Affairs seal, delivered to Martha Lane's mailbox with little ceremony. She almost didn't open it right away, thinking it was just another notice or a delayed billing statement. But something about the texture of the paper felt different, thicker, more formal. She sat at her kitchen table, sunlight slanting through the blinds, casting long shadows across her worn-out placemats. With calloused fingers, she slit the envelope open and unfolded the paper inside. Her eyes moved across the words slowly, line by line, reading them twice, then a third time, before she let the page fall flat against the table. There, in clean bureaucratic language, was an official apology for the mishandling of her case, a formal acknowledgement of her combat service, and a notification that her disability status had been updated retroactively, decades worth of missed compensation and support now formally reinstated. There was even a mention of an award review board reopening her Bronze Star recommendation. Hey, the letter didn't change her face, not immediately, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded it again, not out of emotion but out of something deeper, exhaustion, relief, disbelief, that she had lived long enough to see this day. It was not pride she felt, but a strange, almost painful clarity. Vindication, yes, but the kind that came too late to celebrate. Still, she placed the envelope in a drawer next to her discharge papers and the photograph of her old unit, and she sat for a long time with her eyes closed, breathing it in. This wasn't just a correction, it was a resurrection. Kamahara. Shian kataxiare marath. Shian kataxian. Shian kataxiare heshian. Shian kataxiare marath. Shian kataxian. Shian kataxiara. Board spread faster than she expected. By the following week, a regional representative had arrived at the hospital for a surprise inspection, not because of her alone, but because her case had set off alarms in higher circles. Dr. Arden's report had been circulated to the Oversight Board, and now a team was quietly auditing past cases similar to Martha's. She wasn't the only one they had overlooked, not by a long shot, but she had become the symbol of what had gone wrong, and now of what could be made right. At the hospital, everything changed. Administrators began speaking in cautious tones. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Janine Cordell, once so confident in her position, found herself walking into rooms that fell silent upon her arrival. She had never been publicly reprimanded, but her authority had begun to erode beneath her feet like sand pulled by a rising tide. In the staff lounge, her name came up in whispered conversations, how she had blocked assessments, ignored flags, dismissed veterans without listening. Her decision to challenge Dr. Arden's advocacy had become a mark against her judgment. Her posture stiffened in every hallway she walked, her smiles growing thinner by the day. Meanwhile, Martha was asked to attend a small recognition event. It wasn't meant to be grand, just a modest gathering in the hospital's atrium, a gesture of goodwill from the administration, hosted by the regional director and a few local veterans groups. At first, she declined. Public attention made her uneasy, and she didn't feel like standing in front of a crowd to accept a certificate. But Dr. Arden gently encouraged her, not because the recognition would change her, but because it might change the system around her. So she agreed, reluctantly, and on the day of the event, she wore her dress blues, meticulously preserved, though slightly faded, and arrived at the hospital entrance with the same quiet dignity she carried every day. The atrium was filled with folding chairs and a makeshift podium. A few staff members milled about, unsure of what to expect. The veterans from her support group were there, as was Evelyn Cass, who offered Martha a quiet nod of solidarity. Dr. Arden stood near the back, his arms crossed, watching with a mixture of pride and solemnity. When the ceremony began, the director spoke briefly about service, sacrifice, and the importance of institutional accountability. He mentioned Martha by name, referring to her as a medic who served with valor in the face of overwhelming danger, and read excerpts from the commendation letter aloud. He then turned to present her with a framed certificate, along with a newly minted VA recognition coin. Martha didn't smile as she stepped forward. She simply accepted the certificate with a nod, shook the director's hand, and said thank you in a voice that was calm and firm. The room was silent for a heartbeat longer than expected, and then the applause began. It wasn't thunderous. It was steady, deliberate, and sincere. There were tears in a few eyes, though Martha didn't cry. She just looked around the room, her gaze falling on each person, some who had ignored her for years, others who had just begun to see her clearly. She didn't hold grudges. That wasn't her way. But she didn't forget either. After the ceremony, people came to speak to her. Some offered apologies, some asked questions. A few shared their own service stories, eager to connect. She listened patiently, responded kindly, and left when the crowd thinned. Outside the hospital, under a gray sky that threatened rain, she took a deep breath and looked out toward the flag at half-staff. Her reflection stared back at her faintly in the glass, uniform buttons gleaming, eyes steady. For the first time in years, she saw herself not as someone forgotten, but as someone remembered. In the weeks that followed, other veterans began approaching Lucas, some shyly, others with quiet desperation, asking if he would look into their cases. They spoke of being dismissed, misdiagnosed, overlooked, his office filled with files, his calendar with names. Martha's story had become a beacon, not just for justice, but for acknowledgement, for humanity. Achunahiwais. She didn't ask for any of it. She never had. But her truth, long buried beneath indifference and red tape, had finally found light. And once it did, it illuminated the quiet strength of a woman who had spent her life serving others without expecting anything in return. The hospital would never be the same. And neither would she. Because now, the world finally knew who Martha Lane truly was. In the days following the ceremony, the Spring Hill VA Hospital entered a period of awkward transformation. The walls were still the same shade of beige, the fluorescent lights still buzzed faintly overhead, and the waiting room chairs still creaked beneath the weight of patients who had long since given up expecting swift service. But something subtle had changed in the air, a kind of tension that hummed beneath the usual routine. The staff moved differently now. The nurses at the front desk looked up more often when patients approached. The doctors double-checked their charts with slightly more care. Conversations that had once carried a tone of indifference were now punctuated with longer pauses and reconsiderations. And at the center of this quiet recalibration was a name they could no longer ignore: Martha Lane. Not everyone embraced the shift with grace. There were murmurs, of course, resentment from those who felt embarrassed or exposed by how deeply her case had cut through their complacency. Some employees grumbled that the attention her story drew had made their jobs harder, forced them to justify decisions they'd made for years without question. But others, particularly the younger staff, began to ask questions. Questions about the patients they'd grown accustomed to treating as faceless forms. Questions about what else might have been missed. The administration had no choice but to start internal reviews, and though they framed it as standard procedural updates, everyone knew the catalyst. Dr. Lucas Arden's office became a magnet for movement. Veterans who had once been resigned to silence now requested to see him specifically. Some brought with them folders stuffed with paperwork they didn't understand. Others simply came to talk. Lucas listened to every one of them, often staying late into the evening to write reports, process recommendations, and flag records that needed closer attention. He'd never set out to be anyone's savior. He wasn't interested in heroics. But he believed, unwaveringly, that justice was a matter of follow-through, not sentiment. And Martha's story had only deepened that belief. He didn't publicize what he was doing, but the changes rippled outward, felt even by those who didn't know his name. Janine Cordell, on the other hand, found herself increasingly isolated. Her usual strategies, tight control of schedules, quiet discouragement of dissent, and wielding policy like a shield, no longer held the weight they once did. Too many eyes were watching now. Too many questions were being asked. During an oversight committee review initiated by the regional office, her department was flagged for systemic inconsistencies in patient prioritization and care continuity. The language was sterile, but the meaning was clear. She hadn't just missed the mark, she'd become part of the problem. 1 week after the review concluded, Janine was reassigned to a non-clinical administrative post in another district. The memo cited organizational restructuring, but everyone at Spring Hill knew it was a quiet dismissal. She left without saying goodbye to anyone. As for Martha, she didn't return to the hospital for nearly 2 weeks after the recognition event. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she needed time. Time to process everything that had unfolded. For someone who had lived so much of her life in quiet perseverance, being at the center of change, even for the right reasons, was overwhelming. She spent her days tending to her small garden, watering the potted ferns that lined her porch, and writing in an old notebook she hadn't touched in years. She wrote about her service, not as a memoir, but as a means of making sense of her past. For the first time, she gave herself permission to remember without minimizing, to honor the people she had saved, and the things she had lost without rushing past them. She wrote about blood and noise and the feeling of running toward danger with nothing but a field kit and her own hands. She wrote about silence too, not the kind born of trauma, but the silence of being unseen for so long that even your own memories begin to blur. When she finally returned to the VA for a follow-up appointment, something strange happened. The receptionist greeted her by name, not just with formality, but with respect. The nurse who took her vitals asked how her garden was doing. The psychologist who conducted her reassessment paused before starting to say how honored she felt to sit across from someone who had given so much. Martha wasn't used to it. Part of her wanted to retreat, to wave away the kindness as unnecessary. But another part, deeper and newly awake, let it in, not as praise, but as restoration. Her support group changed too. She became a quiet anchor for the other veterans, many of whom began opening up more freely in her presence. She rarely spoke first, but when she did, her words carried weight. One afternoon, a young Gulf War veteran struggling with severe anxiety looked at her after sharing his story and said, "I didn't think anyone would understand, but then you looked at me, and I just knew." Martha didn't say much in return. She just reached over and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. That was enough. She began volunteering at the hospital in small ways. Nothing grand, just helping in the records room, occasionally walking new patients to their appointments. She wore her badge low on her shirt and never mentioned her history unless asked. But the staff knew, and more importantly, they remembered. Lucas checked on her regularly, not as a physician, but as a friend. They developed a rhythm. Short conversations in hallways, quiet updates over coffee in the break room. She'd never been someone to talk about herself, but with him, she didn't mind the silence between words. He respected her boundaries, and in doing so, earned her trust. Once, when he thanked her again for allowing him to share her story with the review board, she shook her head and said, "You didn't share my story. You just stopped them from burying it." It was the highest compliment he'd ever received. The Spring Hill VA would never make the news. There were no headlines or viral clips to capture what had happened. But the shift was real. Appointments began to run on time. Caseworkers followed up more consistently. And most of all, there was a newfound awareness, a quiet mantra among the staff: don't overlook the quiet ones. It became an inside phrase, repeated with half smiles but full meaning. Martha's life didn't change in dramatic ways. She still lived in the same house, still walked to the market on Saturdays, still drank her coffee black. But the world around her had changed because she'd refused to disappear. She had endured, she had waited, and when the moment came to rise, she didn't demand justice. She simply stood still and let the truth catch up to her. And now, for the first time in years, the silence she returned to wasn't empty. It was peaceful. It was earned. The legacy of Martha Lane was never carved into marble nor etched into a wall beneath shining lights. It didn't need to be. Her legacy was alive, pulsing through the quiet corners of the Spring Hill VA and far beyond, felt in the smallest moments. An extra question asked by a nurse, a second glance taken by a caseworker, a doctor who listened just a little longer than usual. It existed in systems altered by conscience, in protocols now revised to account for the people who don't speak loudly or wave red flags. And above all, it lived in the renewed dignity afforded to veterans who had been made invisible for far too long. Though she remained a private person, Martha could not entirely escape the reach of her story. It spread, softly at first, through conversations between veterans sharing coffee in hospital cafeterias, in Facebook groups quietly dedicated to female service members, and within medical communities reevaluating how they handled trauma cases. No headlines followed. There were no documentaries made, but in the world of those who mattered most, those who had served, those who had struggled, and those who had been overlooked, her name began to carry weight, not celebrity, something deeper, a kind of reverence. One day, months after her recognition at the hospital, she received a handwritten letter from a young woman stationed at a base across the country. The soldier had read about Martha's story through a blog written by another veteran who had attended the Spring Hill VA. The letter was short but powerful. In it, the young woman wrote, "I didn't think anyone would believe someone like me mattered until I heard about you. I'm staying in the fight because you stayed in yours. Thank you." Martha read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it next to her commendation in the same drawer that held all the pieces of a life she had spent decades keeping quiet. The VA administration eventually announced the formation of a new internal committee aimed at identifying and rectifying cases similar to Martha's, veterans whose files had gathered dust while their needs were dismissed or misinterpreted. Dr. Arden was asked to join the initiative as a senior advisor. At first he hesitated. He never wanted to become part of the machinery he so often criticized, but Martha encouraged him in her own gentle way. "Systems don't change themselves," she said during one of their brief walks through the hospital corridor. "They change because someone inside refuses to let them forget." He took the position not for career advancement, but for the chance to ensure no other veteran would have to wait 30 years for recognition. Veterans from around the region began requesting transfers to Spring Hill after hearing about the shift in culture there. They said they heard it was a place where people listened now, where your story didn't have to be told at full volume to matter. For the first time in years, Spring Hill VA found itself cited in regional reports for improvement in patient satisfaction and case responsiveness. These were numbers, yes, but beneath those figures was something real. A slow but profound acknowledgement that one story, one woman's endurance, had quietly shifted the course of things. Martha never took credit. When a local paper asked her for an interview after the new policy changes were announced, she politely declined. "The focus should stay on what's being done, not who caused it," she said. But Lucas made sure she was remembered all the same. Without fanfare, he had a simple plaque made and placed discreetly in the hospital's small courtyard garden, where veterans often went to sit between appointments. It read, "In honor of those who serve in silence, inspired by the resilience of Martha Lane." No one told her it was being installed. But one morning, while walking past the garden on her way out of a checkup, she noticed it. She stopped, read it quietly, then sat on the nearby bench and let the wind pass through her gray hair like a soft blessing. Beyond the hospital, her story began to affect conversations in veteran advocacy groups. A nonprofit dedicated to supporting female veterans reached out to Lucas, asking to use the anonymized version of her case study in training seminars. They wanted new volunteers to understand what service could look like, not just in combat zones, but in waiting rooms, in the gaps between recognition and reality. Martha agreed, under the condition that her name not be attached. It was never about her. It was about every woman who had gone unseen. Every soldier whose story was reduced to paperwork. Every person who had been expected to carry the weight of their service without help, without thanks, without acknowledgement. In town, a few people began to notice Martha more. Not in the way celebrity draws attention, but with a kind of quiet respect. The man at the grocery store who used to hand her change without making eye contact now greeted her with a nod. The librarian who had once looked past her now held her favorite books at the desk when new shipments came in. Children waved at her from porches, not knowing why they felt drawn to her, but sensing something unshakably strong in the way she carried herself. Legacy is often mistaken for fame. But Martha Lane's legacy was far more enduring. It was etched not in headlines, but in the hearts of those who had watched her rise, slowly, silently, and with unwavering grace. It was the whisper of hope in the voice of a young soldier far from home. It was the steady hand of a doctor who chose principle over protocol. It was the ripple that turned into a current, shifting an entire institution toward awareness. And for Martha, who had never needed the world's praise, knowing that others might now be heard, sooner, louder, more clearly, was enough. That was her legacy. Not in the noise she made, but in the silence she broke, once and for all. Though Martha Lane never sought to become a symbol, over time, her story evolved into something more than just a powerful account of overlooked service. It became an unspoken benchmark. Across hospitals, community clinics, and veteran networks, administrators and clinicians who once moved through patient files with mechanical detachment began to pause longer when they saw certain red flags, combat zones, decades-old service dates, unexplained gaps in records. There was no memo declaring a Martha Lane protocol, but the impact was undeniable. She had shifted the way people thought, not by demanding to be seen, but by revealing what happens when someone is ignored for too long. At the VA headquarters, a quiet ripple continued from the committee Lucas had joined. Monthly reports began to include a section that specifically tracked reopened cases based on misclassification or neglect. These cases, many of them decades old, were often complex and required sensitive reevaluation, but they were being seen now, with urgency and empathy. A surprising number of them involved female veterans who, like Martha, had been buried beneath assumptions. One in particular involved a woman in her 70s who had served in medical triage in Afghanistan. She had reported injuries years ago, but they were classified as non-service-related stress. After her case was reopened, her full records showed multiple trauma incidents during an airstrike that had never been formally acknowledged. Her benefits were not only reinstated, but her story was also quietly used as a training case for new claims officers. Martha heard about some of this secondhand, through emails forwarded to her by Lucas, through passing conversations with other veterans, and through whispered gratitude from women who stopped her in parking lots or grocery aisles to say thank you. A former Air Force logistics officer named Cheryl met Martha at a community veteran event and shared, with teary eyes, how she had spent 5 years appealing a denied claim until someone on the phone told her, "Don't worry, we're not missing another Martha Lane." At home, life remained simple. She rose with the sun, kept her habits consistent, and still walked the same routes through her quiet neighborhood. She didn't own a smartphone. She didn't follow social media. But every once in a while, Lucas, or one of the younger veterans, would show her an article online, a blog post or a short essay referencing her influence in vague but reverent terms. She would glance at it, offer a soft hum of acknowledgement, and return to her crossword puzzle or her gardening gloves. It wasn't modesty, it was resolve. Her work had never been about recognition, and that hadn't changed. But what had changed was her sense of peace. After years of moving through the world like a shadow, she had finally stepped into the light and found that it did not burn her. It warmed her. At the hospital, the courtyard bench near the plaque honoring her presence became something of a quiet pilgrimage site for patients waiting on tough diagnoses or heavy conversations. It wasn't uncommon to see someone sitting there, their head bowed, lips moving silently. Some left coins or notes on the bench. Others simply sat and breathed, grounded by the knowledge that strength had once passed through that same space. The staff began calling it Martha's Bench, and it quietly became a part of the institution's fabric. No one dared remove the plaque. Even new administrators understood. This was sacred ground now, consecrated not by ceremony, but by the weight of a life fully lived and finally seen. Lucas himself had changed too. He no longer approached his role with the distant professionalism he had once believed was necessary. Instead, he led with his heart, guided by both science and conscience. He taught new hires not just how to read medical records, but how to listen to the silence between a patient's words. He kept a copy of Martha's old service commendation on his office wall, not as decoration, but as a reminder. Every decision mattered. Every moment of attentiveness could be the one that changed everything for someone. Fa Sun Man. The VA board invited him to speak at a national conference on veteran care systems. His presentation, titled "The Cost of Overlooking Silence," opened with a single image, the faded purple heart tattoo on Martha's forearm. He spoke of her not by name, but by essence, describing her presence, her endurance, her refusal to vanish. The audience, filled with policymakers and clinicians, listened in pin-drop silence. Afterward, several approached him to say it was the first time they'd ever thought about the long-term emotional weight their paperwork could carry. He was later told that 3 VA facilities rewrote their intake training manuals based on principles he outlined in that speech. Back home, the town that had once passed Martha by now carried a quiet pride in her story. The local library added a small veterans archive, curated with the help of volunteers from the community and local service organizations. One of the first submissions was an oral history interview recorded with Martha, an interview she almost declined, but finally agreed to after the librarian promised it would be stored in the back room, only shared with those who asked. "This isn't a display," the librarian had said gently. "It's a record, a way for the future to know the past." Martha sat for the interview with a steady voice, recalling her years in service, the injuries she treated, the names she never forgot. She didn't cry, but her voice did falter once. When she spoke of the day someone finally looked at her tattoo and didn't turn away. That, she said, was the moment she started to believe she might matter again. And maybe that, more than any plaque, policy, or recognition, was her greatest legacy. She reminded the world that people do not stop being valuable just because others stop looking. She showed what it means to live with integrity, even when no one is watching. And in doing so, she gave others permission to be seen, to speak, to stay in the room. Even in her quietest moments, sitting alone on her porch, with the sun dipping low behind the trees, she never felt alone again. Not because of crowds or attention, but because now, finally, undeniably, her story had a place in the world, and it would remain, even when she no longer did. As autumn unfurled over the small town of Ashbridge, leaves gathered in golden drifts along Martha Lane's walkway. The air grew cooler, and the days a little shorter, but inside her modest home, the warmth remained steady. Though she had no children of her own, Martha had begun to receive more and more letters, some handwritten, some typed, some even sent through community centers or VA outreach programs, each one from someone who had heard a piece of her story and had found strength in it. There were notes from young women just entering service who had faced resistance in training, messages from older men long discharged who had never told their families what they endured, and letters from widows of veterans who now wondered what truths their husbands had been too proud or too broken to speak aloud. One such letter came from a woman named Clara Hughes, a retired Air Force technician living across the country. Clara had battled for over 15 years to get recognition for injuries sustained while evacuating a burning barracks during a stateside emergency. Her story, like Martha's, had been buried beneath administrative error and indifference. But after reading about the systemic changes prompted by Martha's case, she had found the courage to appeal again, this time with a renewed fire. In her letter, Clara wrote, "You made me realize that my silence wasn't humility, it was exhaustion, and I'm tired of being tired." Martha read each letter carefully, responding to some, saving all. They were not fan mail, nor were they requests for validation. They were offerings, proof that a single story could give others permission to unlock their own. And it wasn't only veterans who reached out. One teacher wrote about using Martha's story as part of a lesson on overlooked histories and moral courage. A young man in medical school emailed Lucas after hearing him speak, saying he'd decided to shift his specialty to veteran psychiatry because, quote, "people like Martha deserve doctors who see beyond symptoms." Lucas kept her updated on the impact quietly. He never wanted to burden her with the weight of the movement she had unknowingly sparked, but he believed she deserved to know the truth. That her refusal to vanish had created ripples that reached institutions far beyond the brick walls of Spring Hill. The VA had begun implementing a new initiative based on her case, encouraging localized care audits for long-standing patients. In the first quarter alone, over 600 cases were reviewed nationwide, many resulting in overdue compensation, corrected diagnoses, or long-needed therapy. Every one of those outcomes bore the quiet echo of Martha's name. Back in Ashbridge, life went on with gentle rhythm. Martha joined a small knitting circle at the community center, where she rarely spoke of her military past. The women knew who she was, at least in the way locals understood things wordlessly, but they treated her not as a symbol, but as a peer. They talked about books, about aches in their joints, about recipes and stubborn grandchildren. It was, in many ways, the most peace Martha had ever known. She could show up, be present, and not have to explain herself. She could just be Martha. Still, some things lingered beneath the surface. She had always lived with a quiet kind of grief, the grief of all the stories that never got told, of the comrades lost, of the person she might have become had the world seen her earlier. But now, that grief was softer. It didn't grip her. It simply accompanied her, like a shadow that no longer felt like an enemy. Some evenings, she would sit with a cup of tea on her porch, watching the wind stir the trees, and she would allow herself to wonder What her younger self would think if she could see all of this. The thought didn't bring tears. It brought a small, private smile. Nuh-uh. One afternoon, the local high school invited her to speak during Veterans Appreciation Week. The principal had reached out gently, knowing she was a private person, and offered her the choice to simply attend without speaking. To everyone's surprise, Martha agreed. When the day arrived, she stood quietly behind the curtain of the school's modest auditorium, her hands clasped behind her back. She wore a simple blazer, not her uniform. No medals, no need for decoration. When her name was called, there was a respectful pause. Most students didn't know who she was, but the teachers clapped a little longer, and a few parents rose from their seats. Martha stepped onto the stage with the quiet grace of someone who had nothing left to prove. She didn't give a long speech. She simply told them what service had meant to her, not in glory or patriotism, but in people. In the ones she helped, in the ones who never made it home, in the small moments that seemed insignificant at the time but later became everything. She told them that bravery wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just showing up, again and again, even when no one thanked you, even when no one noticed. And when she finished, there was silence, the kind that says people are truly listening. Then, slowly, a wave of applause rose. Not explosive, but deep, like the settling of something heavy and true. Afterward, a teenage girl approached her. She had short hair, wide eyes, and trembling hands. She said her brother had just enlisted, and she was scared for him. She asked Martha how she'd managed to be so brave. Martha looked at the girl and said gently, "I wasn't always, but I kept going anyway." That was all. The girl nodded, hugged her tightly, and ran back to her classmates. That night, as the sky turned indigo and the wind whispered through the trees, Martha sat by her window with the girl's words still echoing in her heart. She had spent years believing her story didn't matter, and now it had lit torches in the hands of others, people she would never meet, in cities she'd never visit, carrying her legacy forward not through speeches or statues but through action, through compassion, through choosing to see what others had once ignored. And as the first frost settled gently on the grass, Martha Lane closed her eyes, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. Because she knew the fire she carried would never be extinguished. Not anymore. It was alive in others now, and it would burn long after she was gone. Amat Sefasara. Winter arrived in Ashbridge with a steady hush, blanketing the town in a thin coat of snow and slowing everything to a contemplative pace. Ice crept along the edges of the sidewalks, windows steamed with the contrast of cold and warmth, and smoke rose in lazy spirals from chimney tops, like quiet reminders of life happening behind closed doors. Martha Lane moved through this season with the calm of someone who no longer fought the urge to be invisible. The battle to be seen had already been won, and not through noise or force, but through a patient, unbreakable presence that had bent time itself to listen. The new year brought a visit from Dr. Lucas Arden, now heading a national review team that was quietly rewriting how long-standing veteran cases were handled. He arrived not in a suit or with fanfare, but in his usual gray coat, a thermos in one hand and a file in the other. He'd come, not for an interview or to ask permission, but simply to talk. Over black coffee at her kitchen table, they spoke of simple things: weather, changes at the hospital, the new intake protocols being tested across regional facilities. Then, gently, Lucas opened the file and slid it across to her. Inside was a preliminary draft of a training manual he was helping to write, one focused on veteran advocacy and systemic redress. On the first page was a dedication to those whose service outlasted their recognition, especially ML. Martha said nothing. She only tapped the edge of the page softly, her gaze lingering a moment before she closed the folder and handed it back. Lucas didn't press. He didn't need to. That was the thing about Martha. She never required the world to understand her fully, But for those who tried, she offered the rare gift of trust. That same week, a small envelope arrived in her mailbox, postmarked from Washington, D.C. Inside was a letter from a senator's office, informing her that a bill had passed committee review that would expand benefits reevaluation rights for veterans over the age of 60. It didn't bear her name, but Lucas had told her it had been inspired in part by the case study that had first shaken the VA's internal system. Hers. A policy born from her patients, built on her truth. She placed the letter in the same drawer where her commendation and folded uniform now rested, gently stacking the pieces of her past, not as burdens, but as quiet victories finally allowed to exist in the open. Built it. Time continued its slow, sacred march. Spring thawed the frost. The town came alive again. Children played in yards, garden centers reopened, and veterans like Martha returned to community centers and group sessions with lighter steps. At the VA, a new wing was being designed to house the growing needs of long-term care patients, and though she had never asked for it, the staff voted to name one of the quiet lounges in her honor. The plaque above the doorway simply read, "The Lane Room, for rest, recovery, and respect." Even in her humility, Martha knew what that meant. Not just to her, but to every soul who sat in that room and understood, maybe for the first time, that their service had not vanished into the cracks of bureaucracy, that someone before them had stood her ground and forced the world to stop, look again, and remember. As the seasons turned again and her steps grew slower, Martha began writing more in her old notebook, filling it with memories she had once pushed away. She wrote about the first field hospital in Kuwait, where the air smelled like sand and diesel. She wrote about faces now long gone, about the cold terror of helicopter evacuations under fire, about the warmth of a wounded soldier's hand gripping hers while whispering home one last time. And she wrote about the silence, the decades of it, and how, in the end, she learned to live with it not as punishment, but as a testament to the strength it had taken to endure. She never wrote for an audience. She never intended for those words to leave her home. But perhaps she knew, deep down, that someday someone would read them. A granddaughter of a soldier, a new VA nurse trying to understand the weight of the uniform, a writer looking for truth. And in those pages, they would find more than facts. They would find a heartbeat that refused to fade. Martha Lane passed away one quiet morning at the age of 72. There was no parade, no news coverage, but word spread among those who mattered. Veterans who had sat beside her in group therapy left flowers on her porch. Staff from the hospital traveled to attend her memorial, sharing stories in hushed tones of how she had changed the way they practiced medicine. Lucas, standing beneath a soft sky that threatened rain, read from her favorite passage in the notebook. "It is enough to be remembered not for what we shouted, but for what we stood through. If my voice trembled, it was only because the silence weighed so much."